What if the most profound silence could scream louder than any word? Elara Vance knew silence. She knew the silence of an empty pantry, the silence of an unanswered phone call from a landlord, and the heavy, expectant silence of a 22-year-old's dream deferred. But none of those compared to the silence she witnessed every Tuesday and Thursday night from Table 14 at Ethel Gard, the most ostentatiously opulent restaurant in all of downtown Chicago. This was the silence of Lily Finch, a girl of about 8 with eyes the color of a stormy sea, who sat across from a father who commanded empires with his voice, but couldn't seem to bridge the 3 feet of polished mahogany between them. Lily had a silence born of a world that was too loud, too bright, too much. She was non-verbal, autistic, and moved through life in a bubble of her own meticulous design. Her father, Alistair Finch, was a man whose face was a permanent fixture on the covers of business magazines, a titan of technology whose net worth had more commas than Elara's student loan debt had zeros. He was handsome, in a severe, joyless way, his silver-streaked hair perfectly coiffed, his bespoke suits looking more like armor than clothing. He brought his daughter to Ethelgard twice a week, like a man fulfilling a court-ordered obligation, his attention perpetually chained to the glowing screen of his phone. Elara had been a waitress at Ethelgard for 6 months, a grueling, high-pressure job that paid just enough to cover her rent and the tuition for her night classes in developmental psychology. She'd learned to read the subtle tales of the city's elite, the dismissive wave of a hand that meant, "You are invisible to me," the tight smile that was a harbinger of a complaint about the wine temperature. But she read Lily Finch differently. She saw the minute tightening of the girl's shoulders when a cart rattled by, the way her small hands would begin to flutter like trapped birds when her father's voice grew sharp on a conference call. Elara recognized these signals not from a waitress's intuition, but from the dense, underlined pages of her textbooks. She saw a child communicating her distress in the only way she knew how, and a father who was utterly, tragically deaf to it. But tonight was different. Tonight, the fragile peace of Table 14 was about to be shattered by the arrival of Beatrice van der Meer, a woman whose inherited wealth was matched only by her cultivated cruelty. Beatrice and her 2 companions, draped in diamonds and disdain, were seated at the adjacent table, and as Elara watched from the shadows of a service station, her heart began to pound, a frantic, preemptive rhythm against her ribs. She saw Beatrice's gaze fix on Lily, who was quietly arranging sugar packets into a perfect, repeating pattern. Beatrice's lip curled in a sneer so faint it was almost imperceptible, but to Elara it was as loud as a gunshot. What Elara would do next wasn't just about protecting a child. It was an act of rebellion that would detonate a bomb in the quiet, gilded cage of Alistair Finch's life, forcing him to finally hear the silence he had so long ignored. Elara's shift had started like any other, a whirlwind of memorizing specials, pan-seared scallops with a saffron risotto, duck confit with a cherry reduction, and ensuring her apron was flawlessly starched. Her mind, however, was miles away, wrestling with concepts from her latest reading assignment, sensory integration dysfunction, the neurobiology of anxiety in nonverbal children. She often felt like she was living a double life. By day, a smiling, deferential servant to the 1%. By night, a determined student trying to understand the very children who were often hidden away from the polished worlds she served. When Alistair Finch and Lily arrived, the restaurant's manager, Gerard, a man whose spine seemed to be made of gelatin, personally escorted them to their regular table. "Mr. Finch, a pleasure as always," Gerard oozed. "And the lovely Miss Lily. We have your favorite sparkling apple juice ready." Alistair gave a curt nod, already pulling out his phone. Lily, clutching a well-loved tablet with a thick, purple case, slid into the booth. She didn't acknowledge Gerard. Her focus was entirely on the task of settling into the overwhelming environment. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of silver on porcelain, the bright, focused spotlights on each table. For Lily, it was a constant, low-grade assault. Elara knew this. She'd watched the girl for months, cataloguing her coping mechanisms. The way she'd trace the patterns on the damask tablecloth with one finger, the subtle rocking motion only visible if you were looking for it, the intense focus on her tablet, which wasn't a toy but a lifeline, her primary means of communication through a specialized app. Elara approached the table, her movements deliberately slow and quiet. "Good evening, Mr. Finch. Lily," she said, her voice soft. She made a point to address Lily directly, even if she didn't get a verbal response. It was about acknowledging her presence, her personhood. Alistair grunted something without looking up. Lily, however, briefly glanced at Elara, a flicker of recognition in her deep blue eyes, before returning her gaze to her tablet. It was the most interaction Elara ever got, and she treasured it. It was then that Beatrice van der Meer's party was seated. The air immediately grew colder. Beatrice surveyed the room as if it were her personal kingdom, her eyes landing on Lily. "Honestly, Gerard," Beatrice said to the hovering manager, her voice carrying like a shard of ice. "Must we be seated next to the entertainment?" Gerard's face flushed. "Mrs. van der Meer, Mr. Finch is one of our most valued patrons." "Valued or not, some consideration for the general ambiance would be appreciated," she sniffed, turning to her friends. "It's a restaurant, not a therapy clinic." Elara felt a hot surge of anger. She saw Lily's hands, which had been resting on her tablet, begin to twitch. The girl was absorbing the hostility in the air, even if she couldn't process the specific words. Alistair, deep in an email, heard nothing. He was a fortress of willful ignorance, and his daughter was the undefended territory outside the walls. Elara took their order, Alistair's usual steak, medium rare, and Lily's plain pasta with butter, cut into small, manageable pieces. As she walked away, she heard Beatrice's friend, a woman with a face pulled unnaturally tight, whisper, "Is that the Finch girl? I heard about her. Such a tragedy for him. His wife, you know. She was the one who handled all that." The comment was a missing puzzle piece for Elara. She knew Alistair Finch's wife had died in a car accident about a year ago. The tabloids had covered it extensively. Elara had always assumed Alistair was just a typical, work-obsessed rich man. But now, a more complex, sorrowful picture began to form. He wasn't just a distracted father. He was a grieving widower, a man suddenly thrust into a role he was completely unprepared for, a role his late wife had apparently mastered. His distance wasn't just neglect, it was a profound, paralyzing failure to cope. He wasn't ignoring his daughter, he was ignoring his grief, and Lily was the living, breathing embodiment of it. This realization didn't excuse his behavior, but it deepened the tragedy of it. He was failing his daughter, not out of malice, but out of a pain so deep he couldn't bear to look at its most obvious reminder. And Lily, in turn, was left to navigate her confusing world and her own silent grief without her mother, her anchor, and with a father who was emotionally adrift. When Elara returned with their drinks, she saw that Lily's agitation had increased. Her hands were now flapping rhythmically beside her face, a classic self-soothing behavior known as stimming. It was a sign she was trying to regulate a sensory system that was rapidly approaching overload. Beatrice and her friends were now staring openly, whispering behind their manicured hands. How distracting, Beatrice said, loud enough for a clear message to be sent. One would think a man of his means could afford a proper caretaker to manage the outbursts. Alistair finally looked up from his phone, not because of Beatrice's comment, but because Lily had accidentally knocked over her glass of sparkling apple juice. The liquid spread across the white tablecloth, and the sudden, unexpected chaos of it was too much for the little girl. A small, distressed sound escaped her lips, a high-pitched whine of pure overload. "Lily, for heaven's sake, be careful," Alistair snapped, his voice sharp with embarrassment rather than concern. He grabbed a napkin and began sopping up the mess, his movements jerky and irritated. "Just be still, will you?" That was the spark. The combination of her father's sharp tone and the open hostility from the next table was the final blow to Lily's fragile composure. The quiet stimming escalated into frantic flapping. The low whine became a series of distressed, guttural sounds. She wasn't having a tantrum, she was having a meltdown. Her brain was a circuit board with a power surge, and all the fuses were blowing at once. Alistair's face was a mask of controlled fury and humiliation. He was trying to silence her, grabbing her hands gently. "Lily, stop it, stop. You're making a scene." "See?" Beatrice declared triumphantly to her friends, completely out of control. Ilara's training, her empathy, and a deep, primal sense of justice all converged in that single, terrible moment. She saw the manager, Gerard, scurrying over, his face pale with panic, ready to placate Beatrice at any cost. She saw Alistair, a powerful man rendered utterly impotent by a situation he refused to understand. And she saw Lily, a terrified child drowning in a sea of sensory and emotional chaos, being blamed for her own suffering. Ilara put down her tray. She took a deep, steadying breath and walked directly into the storm. Ilara moved with a purpose that felt both terrifying and liberating. Every instinct honed by months of thankless service screamed at her to stay invisible, to let the manager handle it, to protect her job. But the knowledge from her textbooks, the image of a drowning child, propelled her forward. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only person in the room who spoke Lily's language. She bypassed Gerard, who was already stammering apologies to Beatrice's table, and went straight to table 14. She knelt, bringing herself down to Lily's eye level, deliberately placing her body between the frightened girl and the venomous stares of the other patrons. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Please let go of her hands. It's making it worse." Alistair looked at her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of shock and fury. "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do with my daughter? Just clean this up." "Her hands are how she's trying to cope," Ilara insisted, ignoring his command. She kept her gaze soft, directed past him towards Lily. "It's called stimming. It's a regulatory behavior. Holding them down is like holding a drowning person's head underwater." The clinical precision of her words, so out of place coming from a waitress, seemed to momentarily stun Alistair into inaction. He loosened his grip. Beatrice, however, was not to be ignored. "Well, I never. Are you the staff here or her psychiatrist? Gerard, I insist you remove this disruptive family. They are ruining a very expensive evening for everyone." Gerard, desperate to appease his wealthiest customer, turned on Ilara. "Miss Vance, that is enough. Apologize to Mrs. Vandermeer and return to the kitchen immediately." Ilara stood up slowly, turning to face Beatrice. The entire restaurant was now silent, watching the drama unfold. This was her moment of choice, her job or this child's dignity. It wasn't even a choice. "Mrs. Vandermeer," Ilara said, her voice shaking slightly, but imbued with an authority she didn't know she possessed. This little girl is not a disruption. She is a human being who is in distress. The disruption is the palpable hostility coming from your table. The disruption is your complete lack of basic human decency. A collective gasp went through the room. Beatrice's face, already a taut canvas of cosmetic enhancement, turned a shade of mottled purple. "How dare you! You are a servant! You will be fired for this! I will buy this restaurant and have you blacklisted from every establishment in this city. You can buy the building, ma'am, but you can't buy class, and you certainly can't buy compassion," Elara retorted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She turned her back on the sputtering socialite and knelt by Lily again. The girl's meltdown was subsiding slightly, the peak of the crisis having passed, but she was still trembling, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Elara noticed the tablet on the floor. She picked it up. Its screen was still on, open to the communication app. The main page was full of icons. I want, I feel, I need. With a gentle hand, Elara guided Lily's trembling finger to the I feel icon. A new screen appeared with faces. Happy, sad, angry, scared. Lily's finger hovered, then decisively tapped the icon for scared. Then she navigated to another screen and tapped an icon of a person with hands over their ears, and another of a house. Elara looked up at Alistair, whose face had gone from anger to a state of pale, dumbfounded shock. "She's scared," Elara translated softly, holding up the tablet. "It's too loud. She wants to go home." It was a revelation, a Rosetta Stone for a language he'd never bothered to learn. For the first time, his daughter's chaotic behavior was translated into a simple, coherent, heartbreaking request. She wasn't being difficult. She was terrified and asking for help. The weight of it all seemed to land on Alistair Finch at once. The public humiliation, the waitress's rebuke, his daughter's translated fear. He looked from the tablet to Lily's tear-streaked face, to Elara's steady, expectant eyes. He saw the sneering face of Beatrice van der Meer and the cowering form of his manager. In that moment, the entire hollow edifice of his life, the deals, the reputation, the public image he so carefully curated, crumbled to dust. "You're fired, Vance! Get your things and get out!" Gerard shrieked, finally finding his voice. Alistair stood up, his full height seeming to command the space around him. He gently scooped the trembling Lily into his arms, holding her close. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small body racked with shudders. He looked directly at Gerard, his voice dangerously quiet. "No, she's not." Then he turned his gaze to Beatrice van der Meer. The cold fury in his eyes was something he usually reserved for hostile takeover attempts. "Beatrice," he said, the name dripping with contempt. "You have been a blight on this city's social scene for 20 years, but tonight you have surpassed yourself. If you ever speak to or look at my daughter again, I will marshal the full weight of my resources to dismantle your late husband's legacy, stock by stock, and board seat by board seat. Is that clear?" Beatrice van der Meer, for the first time in her pampered life, was speechless. Alistair didn't wait for an answer. Cradling Lily, he walked towards the exit. He paused at the door and looked back, not at his vanquished foe, but at the young waitress who had just sacrificed her job for his child. Their eyes met across the stunned, silent dining room. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of debt, of something profound and unspoken. Then he was gone, leaving Elara alone in the wreckage of her career, her heart pounding with a terrifying mix of triumph and dread. The silence that followed Alistair's departure was heavier and more charged than any that had come before. All eyes in the restaurant were on Elara. She felt like an insect under a microscope, her every breath scrutinized. Gerard, his face a pasty white, scurried over to her. "Out!" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Now, clean out your locker. You are finished." Ilara didn't argue. She knew it was coming. She held her head high as she walked through the dining room, past the gawking patrons, and the now silent table where Beatrice van der Meer sat, for once, looking small and defeated. In the staff locker room, she changed out of her uniform, the crisp black and white feeling like a costume from another life. As she packed her few belongings into her worn backpack, her psychology textbook, a half-eaten granola bar, a picture of her parents, a wave of panic finally washed over her. What had she done? She had stood up to a bully and defended a child, yes, but she had also gotten herself fired from a job she desperately needed. Rent was due in a week. Her tuition payment was looming. The triumph she had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her precarious finances. She had acted on principle, but principles didn't pay the bills. She walked out the back alley door, into the cool Chicago night, the restaurant's curated warmth and elegance a world away. The city light seemed harsh and indifferent. She started the long walk to the L train station, her mind racing. She could start looking for another waitressing job tomorrow, but a position like the one at Ethelgard was rare. The tips alone had been her lifeline. The next 2 days were a blur of anxiety and fruitless job searching. She emailed her resume to a dozen restaurants, getting only automated replies. She walked into several others, only to be told they weren't hiring. The feeling of dread grew with each rejection. The memory of the confrontation played over and over in her mind. Had she been too harsh, too self-righteous? But every time she came to the same conclusion. She would do it again. She couldn't have stood by and done nothing. On the third day, as she was nursing a cheap coffee in a cafe and using their free Wi-Fi to scan job boards, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number with a downtown area code. She almost ignored it, assuming it was a spammer. But something made her answer. "Hello? Is this Ilara Vance?" The voice was female, professional, and crisp. "Yes, speaking. My name is Cynthia Albright. I'm the executive assistant to Mr. Alistair Finch. Mr. Finch would like to request a meeting with you. Would you be available to come to his office at Finch Enterprises this afternoon at 2 o'clock? Ilara was so stunned she almost dropped her phone. "Mr. Finch? Why?" "He wishes to speak with you regarding the events at Ethelgard on Tuesday evening," Cynthia said, her tone giving nothing away. "A car will be sent to your location in 30 minutes if you accept." Ilara's mind reeled. Was he going to sue her, threaten her further? Or was this something else? Her curiosity and a sliver of hope warred with her fear. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll be there." The car that arrived was a sleek, black sedan with tinted windows, the kind she usually saw gliding through the financial district. The ride to Finch Enterprises was silent and surreal. The building itself was a monument of steel and glass that pierced the Chicago skyline, a testament to the power of the man who worked at its summit. Cynthia Albright, a woman in her 50s with an impeccably tailored suit and an air of quiet competence, met her in the lobby. She led Ilara to a private elevator that whisked them to the top floor. The doors opened into a sprawling office that seemed more like a modern art gallery than a place of business. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city and Lake Michigan. In the center of it all, standing and looking out the window, was Alistair Finch. He turned as she entered. In the harsh light of day, without the soft, forgiving ambiance of the restaurant, he looked older and profoundly tired. The armor was gone. "Miss Vance?" he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to a pair of leather chairs. "Please." Ilara sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Cynthia discreetly closed the door, leaving them alone. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here," he began, sitting opposite her. "I assume you are no longer employed at Ethelgard." "I was fired on the spot," Ilara confirmed, her voice steady. He nodded, a flicker of something, shame perhaps, in his eyes. "I spoke to their corporate ownership yesterday. Gerard is no longer the manager, and I have instructed my lawyers to acquire a controlling interest in that restaurant group. Not to own it, but to ensure their employee training includes mandatory sensitivity and disability awareness. What happened to you will not happen to someone else." Ilara was taken aback. This was not what she expected. Thank you. But you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said, his voice firm. He leaned forward, his hands steepled. "Miss Vance, for the last year, since my wife, since Caroline died, I have been adrift. She was the one who understood Lily. She learned everything. She fought for her. She created a world where Lily felt safe. When she was gone, I thought I could manage it by providing the best schools, the best therapists, the best things. I thought that was my job, to provide." He paused, looking out the window at the vast city below. "I've been running my company, my life, on autopilot, and I've been running from my daughter, because every time I look at her, I see Caroline, and I see my own inadequacy. On Tuesday night, you didn't just stand up to a bully. You held up a mirror, and I was forced to look at the man I've become. A man who sits 3 feet from his own child and remains deaf, dumb, and blind to her suffering." His confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Ilara felt her animosity toward him dissolve, replaced by a profound wave of sympathy. "You said things," he continued, turning his intense gaze back to her. "About stimming, about sensory overload. You used words my wife used to use. You understood what was happening in a way I never have. You didn't just see a misbehaving child. You saw her." "How?" This was the moment, the reason she was here. "I'm studying," Ilara said quietly. "I'm in my 3rd year of a developmental psychology program with a focus on neurodivergence in children. I work at night to pay for it. What I saw in Lily, it wasn't just a guess. It was pattern recognition from my studies." Alistair stared at her, a slow understanding dawning on his face. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a lucky guess from a kind-hearted waitress. It was knowledge. It was expertise. "I haven't been able to get Lily to calm down since that night," he admitted, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that seemed utterly alien to the powerful man in front of her. "The therapists are trying, but there's a wall. She won't engage. She just hides. But she responded to you. In that moment, in the middle of all that chaos, she trusted you." He took a deep breath. "I'm not offering you a job as a waitress, Miss Vance, and I'm not offering you charity. I'm asking for your help. I'm asking you to teach me how to be a father to my own daughter. I want to hire you as a consultant, a specialist. I will pay for the remainder of your education and a salary that will ensure you never have to worry about rent again. Your only job will be to help me bridge the silence between me and Lily." The offer was staggering, a fairy tale solution to all her problems. But looking at the desperate hope in this broken man's eyes, Ilara knew it was more than that. It was a chance to put her knowledge into practice, to make a real, tangible difference. It was a chance to help a little girl find her voice, and a father learn how to listen. "Okay, Mr. Finch," Elara said, a new sense of purpose solidifying within her. "Let's get to work." The transition from waitress to consultant was jarring. One day, Elara was polishing silverware. The next, she was walking through the marble-floored entrance of Alistair Finch's palatial penthouse apartment overlooking Lincoln Park. The space was beautiful, minimalist, and sterile, like a luxury hotel suite that no one actually lived in. It was a home built for a man who was never there and a child who was lost within it. Her first few sessions were observational. She watched Alistair and Lily interact, or rather, fail to interact. He would try to engage her with a kind of forced, awkward cheerfulness. "Want to build some blocks, Lilypad? Look, a big tower." He'd build the tower, Lily would ignore him, and he'd retreat to his laptop, frustration and disappointment etched on his face. Lily, in turn, would spend hours on her tablet, not just on the communication app, but watching the same 3-second clips of animated characters spinning in circles, over and over. It was another form of stimming, a predictable visual loop that calmed her anxious mind. Elara's first piece of advice was simple, yet revolutionary for Alistair. "Stop trying to pull her into your world," she told him one afternoon, after another failed attempt at interaction. "You need to enter hers." "What does that mean?" he asked, genuinely perplexed. "It means you sit on the floor with her. You don't talk. You don't try to direct her play. You just exist in her space. If she's lining up toy cars, you get some cars and line them up next to hers. Parallel play. You're not demanding anything from her. You're just showing her you can share her world without disrupting it." It was an agonizing process for a man like Alistair, a man whose entire life was about directing, commanding, and achieving results. To simply be was an alien concept. The first time he tried it, he lasted 7 minutes before he was checking his watch. "This is pointless," he muttered. "She doesn't even know I'm here." "She knows," Elara countered gently. "Right now your presence is associated with demands and stress. You need to rewire that association. It takes time. More time than you're used to giving anything that doesn't show a quarterly profit." The remark was sharp, but he accepted it. He was trying, she had to give him that. He was slowly, painfully, learning patience. Elara's primary focus was on communication. She discovered that Lily's expensive, state-of-the-art communication app was programmed with generic, clinical phrases. Elara spent a week completely revamping it. She worked with Alistair to add icons specific to Lily's life. Pictures of her late mother, Caroline, an icon for "I miss Mommy," an icon for her favorite blanket, for the specific brand of gluten-free crackers she liked, for the spinning clips she loved to watch. She was personalizing the language, giving Lily the tools to express not just basic needs, but her actual, individual self. The breakthrough came 3 weeks in. Elara and Alistair were sitting on the floor, a few feet from Lily, who was, as usual, watching her spinning videos. Alistair, following Elara's instruction, was just sitting quietly, not looking at his phone for once. After about 20 minutes of silence, Lily put down her tablet. She crawled over to her father, picked up his large hand, and placed it on her head. She then looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. Alistair froze, looking at Elara in a panic. "What do I do?" he whispered. "She's asking for deep pressure," Elara whispered back, her heart soaring. "It's calming for her. Just press down on her head, gently but firmly." Hesitantly, Alistair did as he was told. He pressed his hand onto his. The first time his daughter initiated positive physical contact in over a year, Alistair Finch didn't feel joy. He felt terror. It was the terror of a man holding a priceless, impossibly fragile piece of crystal, convinced that his own clumsy largeness would inevitably shatter it. As Lily's low, contented hum vibrated through his palm and up his arm, it felt less like a sound of comfort and more like a countdown timer. He was acutely aware of Ilara's watchful presence, her quiet approval, a source of both validation and immense pressure. He held his breath, counting the seconds, until Lily, her need met, simply pulled away and returned to her tablet. Only then did the tears come, hot and stinging, not of happiness, but of profound, agonizing relief. He hadn't broken it. Not this time. That fragile moment became the cornerstone upon which they began to build. Progress was not a straight line, but a painstaking, meandering path through a dense fog. There were days of stunning clarity, where Lily, using the tablet Ilara had meticulously customized, would tap the icon for park, then the icon of a duck, then the icon for happy, stringing together a coherent narrative of desire and emotion that left Alistair breathless. On those days, he would cancel billion-dollar merger calls without a second thought, his entire world shrinking to the size of a playground swing set and the sound of his daughter's rare, quiet laughter. He was learning her language, a lexicon of sensory needs and silent requests. He learned that the hum of the refrigerator was a monster, but the drone of the dishwasher was a lullaby. He learned that her favorite texture was not cashmere, but the worn, nubby wool of his oldest sweater. He learned that her grief for her mother wasn't a singular event, but a recurring weather pattern, and on stormy days she needed the piano lullaby and the scent of Caroline's old perfume on a scarf he kept in a drawer. Ilara was the architect of this fragile piece, the translator of its esoteric grammar. Yet, she found herself in an increasingly precarious position. She was no longer just a consultant. She was the emotional grout holding the family together. She was present for dinners, for bedtime stories read aloud to a child who processed the rhythm more than the words, for weekend trips to the aquarium where the slow, silent drift of jellyfish was the only spectacle that could hold Lily's attention for hours. She saw the way Alistair had begun to look at her, not with desire, but with a kind of desperate reliance, as if she were the sole possessor of the map to his own child. A dangerous dependency was forming, and the professional boundaries she had once imagined as clear, bright lines were becoming blurred and indistinct. This fragile new world was built on a fault line, and the tremor that would shatter it arrived not as a sound, but as a sheaf of thick, cream-colored paper delivered by a courier. The lawsuit from Beatrice Vandermeer was not merely a legal document, it was a declaration of total war. It was meticulously crafted, a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It painted Alistair as a volatile, abusive parent, and Lily not as a child with a disability, but as a public menace, a product of negligent parenting. Most cruelly, it named Ilara, casting her as a manipulative charlatan who had preyed on a grieving man, insinuating herself into his life for financial gain. It sought not just damages, but a court-ordered psychological evaluation of Alistair to determine his fitness as a parent. The document did more than threaten Alistair's reputation. It detonated a bomb deep within his psyche. The patient, gentle father he had been striving to become vanished in an instant, consumed by the cold, white-hot rage of the corporate predator he had been for decades. The ghost in the machine of his old life roared back to the forefront. "I'm going to bury her," he snarled, the phone already pressed to his ear, his chief counsel on the line. The quiet of the penthouse was replaced by the clipped, brutal language of litigation. "I want discovery on every aspect of her life. her finances, her friends, her charities. Find the rot and expose it. I want her name to be synonymous with social leprosy. I want her to regret the day she was born." Ilara watched him, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. This was the man from the restaurant, but magnified, empowered by her righteous fury. This was the fortress, and the walls were going back up, higher and thicker than before. "Alistair, stop," she pleaded, once he had hung up. "You can't do this." "Watch me," he shot back, his eyes like chips of granite. "She came after my child. She came after you. There is no line I won't cross to protect my family." "By becoming the monster she claims you are," Ilara challenged, her voice rising. "This isn't protection, it's annihilation. And Lily will be the collateral damage. This will be a media circus. Her picture will be everywhere. Her diagnosis will be debated on cable news by talking heads who don't know the first thing about her. You've spent months building a sanctuary for her, and you're about to invite the entire world to come and trample it." "It's the only way," he insisted, his jaw clenched. "You show weakness, they devour you." "That is the language of the boardroom, not the language of a home," she cried. "The only victory that matters here is Lily's peace of mind, and your strategy will destroy it." Their argument was a clash of two worlds, and it was a battle Ilara lost. In the weeks that followed, Alistair became a ghost in his own home. He was consumed by the lawsuit, locked away in his office for hours on end with his legal team. The quiet patience he had cultivated evaporated. When he emerged, he was distracted, his temper short, his phone a permanent extension of his hand. He started missing his sessions with Lily, delegating her care to the household staff. The parallel play ceased. The piano fell silent. Lily felt the shift immediately. The architecture of their new piece began to crumble. Her stimming, which had subsided to gentle, rhythmic rocking, returned with a frantic, distressed energy. She retreated deep into herself, into the predictable, looping world of her tablet. She began refusing foods she had previously enjoyed. One evening, when Alistair, frustrated by a legal setback, snapped at her for spilling her juice, Lily didn't just have a meltdown. She flinched away from him, a raw, primal fear in her eyes that Ilara hadn't seen since that first night at Ethelgard. He had not just broken the fragile crystal, he had ground it to dust under his heel. The lawsuit's discovery phase was as brutal as Ilara had feared. She was forced to sit for a deposition in a sterile, wood-paneled conference room, facing Beatrice's lead attorney, a man with a reptilian smile and merciless eyes. For 6 hours he dissected her life. He twisted her academic pursuits into a calculated scheme. He painted her empathy as opportunism. He used clinical terms from her own textbooks against her, suggesting she had manipulated a vulnerable child's symptoms to her own advantage. He made her feel dirty, fraudulent, and naive. She left the deposition feeling hollowed out, her confidence shattered. That night, she found Alistair in his office, a bottle of scotch on his desk, staring at a wall of screens displaying legal documents. "I can't do this anymore, Alistair," she said, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fury. "This war of yours, it's poisoning everything. That lawyer made me feel like a criminal for caring about your daughter. And you are so lost in this fight, you can't see that you've already surrendered the one thing you were supposed to be fighting for. You've lost her again." "I'm trying to protect her," he roared, slamming his fist on the desk. The sound echoed through the silent penthouse. "By abandoning her? By filling her home with the same anger and noise and tension that makes the outside world unbearable for her?" Ilara's voice cracked. "Look at her. She's terrified of you again. All that work, all that trust, it's gone. If this is how you choose to fight, I can't be a part of it. I quit." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The silence that followed was broken by a sound from the doorway. A small, sharp gasp. They both turned. Lily was standing there, her small frame silhouetted against the hall light. She was holding her tablet, her knuckles white. She had heard everything, the shouting, the anger, the word quit. Her face was a pale mask of terror. Her sensory world, already thrown into chaos by weeks of simmering tension, had just been hit by an emotional earthquake. Her meltdown was immediate and violent. It was worse than the one in the restaurant. She dropped the tablet, its screen cracking on the hardwood floor. A keening, guttural wail tore from her throat as she pressed her palms hard against her ears. She began to rock back and forth, her movements jerky and convulsive, her small body overwhelmed by a tidal wave of fear and sensory overload. Alistair froze, the anger draining from his face, replaced by a ghastly, impotent panic. He saw not a tantrum, but the raw, unfiltered agony of his daughter's soul, an agony he had directly caused. Elara, her own anger forgotten, rushed to Lily's side, but the girl recoiled, scrambling away from both of them, her cries intensifying. She was lost, and the two anchors of her world had become the source of the storm. It was in that moment of utter despair that Alistair Finch finally, truly, broke. The Titan shattered. The rage, the ego, the decades of solving problems with force and intimidation, all of it crumbled into ash. He sank to his knees, his expensive suit crumpling on the floor. "Lily," he choked out, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with lawsuits or reputations. "I'm sorry. Daddy's so sorry." He didn't try to touch her. He just knelt there, on the floor, utterly defeated. He was no longer a CEO at war. He was just a father who had terribly, catastrophically failed his child. Elara watched him, her heart aching. This was his moment of truth. Not in a courtroom, not at a press conference, but here, on the floor of his office, in the face of his daughter's unbearable pain. Slowly, agonizingly, the peak of Lily's meltdown passed. The wails subsided into ragged, hitching sobs. Her frantic movements slowed. Through her tears, she crawled to her fallen tablet. The screen was fractured, a spiderweb of cracks distorting the familiar icons, but it still worked. Her small, trembling finger moved across the broken glass. She didn't tap scared. She didn't tap loud. She tapped the icon for father. Then she tapped the icon for broken heart. Then, with a heartbreaking finality, she navigated to a new screen Elara had added, a screen with photos of the people in her life. She tapped the picture of Beatrice Vandermeer, and then she tapped the icon for broken heart again. Elara translated softly, her own voice thick with tears. "She's saying your heart is broken. And she thinks Beatrice's heart is broken too." The simple, profound empathy of it struck Alistair like a physical blow. In the midst of her own terror and pain, his daughter was not condemning him, but identifying his hurt. And she was extending that same incredible insight to the very woman causing their suffering. She saw not a monster, but another broken person. In that moment, Alistair understood. Lily's silence wasn't an absence of thought, but an absence of artifice. She saw the world with a devastating, unclouded clarity. He had been fighting a war of egos, a battle of noise and fury, while his daughter was speaking a language of pure, unadulterated emotion. To win his war, he had to lose everything. To win his daughter, he had to surrender. The next morning, Alistair Finch did something that sent shock waves through his legal team. He fired them, all of them. He then placed a single call to Beatrice Vandermeer's attorney and requested a private, off-the-record mediation. He had only 2 conditions: that it take place in his home and that both Ilara and Lily be present. Beatrice arrived a week later, flanked by her lawyer, her face a mask of triumphant disdain. She clearly expected a grovelling settlement offer. They met not in an office, but in the main living area, a space now softened with sensory-friendly lighting and plush rugs. Alistair was not dressed in a suit, but in the old nubby wool sweater that Lily loved. "Beatrice," he began, his voice devoid of anger or aggression. It was quiet, tired, and clear. "I did not ask you here to negotiate. I asked you here to apologize." The surprise on her face was comical. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "My behavior in that restaurant was unacceptable," Alistair continued. "I was a father in pain, and I used my power and my voice to threaten and humiliate you. It was the act of a bully, and for that, I am truly sorry." He paused, letting the words settle. "However, my apology is for my actions, not for my motive. I will always defend my daughter. But I have come to realize that the best way to defend her is not to build higher walls or fight louder wars. It is to build a world that is kinder and more understanding. A world that has room for her." He then looked toward Lily, who was sitting quietly on a sofa with Ilara, observing the scene with her wide, stormy sea eyes. "This is my daughter Lily," he said, as if introducing her for the first time. "She is not a disruption. She is not a tragedy. She is the most honest and perceptive human being I have ever known. She has taught me more about strength and empathy in the last few months than I learned in 50 years of life." He gestured to Lily, who looked at him, then at Ilara, who gave her a subtle, encouraging nod. Lily picked up her new, undamaged tablet. She took a deep, steadying breath and walked slowly, deliberately, across the room. She stopped directly in front of Beatrice van der Meer. For a long moment, she just looked at the woman, her gaze direct and searching. Then, she lifted her tablet. She tapped a single icon. It was not a word. It was not an emotion. It was a picture of a single, perfect, white gardenia, Caroline Finch's favorite flower, an icon Ilara had added to the mommy page. Beatrice stared at the image on the screen, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. She had known Caroline. They had served on charity boards together years ago. The flower was an unexpected, disarming symbol of a shared past, of a woman they both had known. It was a gesture of peace, of memory, of a shared humanity that transcended the ugliness of their present conflict. It was a move for which her high-priced lawyer had no counter-argument. A single, difficult tear traced a path through Beatrice's expensive makeup. She looked from the tablet to the small, silent girl, offering this strange, digital olive branch. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a problem. She was looking at a child. The lawsuit was withdrawn the next day. There was no press release, no public statement. It simply vanished, a quiet, unceremonious end to a war that had almost cost Alistair everything. Ilara never quit. Her role, however, was fundamentally redefined. She was no longer just a consultant. Alistair, humbled and transformed, asked her to be something more. A partner. Not in a romantic sense, but in a deeper, more profound one. He established a new entity, not a massive public foundation, but a small, fiercely focused private trust. Its sole purpose was to fund Ilara's life and work. It would pay for her to complete her doctorate and pursue any postdoctoral research she chose. It would give her a permanent seat on Lily's educational and therapeutic team. It would provide her with a lifetime salary that ensured she would never again know the silence of an empty pantry. Her only mandate was to continue to be what she had always been, a voice for the silent and a light in their world. Months later, on a warm autumn afternoon, the three of them were not in the penthouse, but in the sprawling, overgrown garden of Alistair's country estate, a place he had avoided since Caroline's death. He and Elara had spent the past weeks transforming a section of it into a sensory garden for Lily, full of wind chimes with low, resonant tones, lamb's ear with its soft, fuzzy leaves, and fragrant herbs. Lily was not on her tablet. She was kneeling in the soft dirt, her small hands carefully patting the soil around a newly planted lavender bush. Alistair knelt beside her, his hands also covered in earth, mirroring her actions. There was an easy, comfortable silence between them now, a silence born not of distance, but of complete understanding. Elara watched them from a nearby bench, her psychology textbook lying forgotten beside her. She wasn't an architect or a translator anymore. She was simply a part of the landscape, a cherished feature of their new world. Lily finished her planting, then looked up at her father. She reached out, and with a dirt-smudged finger, she traced a letter on the back of his hand. An L, then an O, a V, an E. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. He looked at his daughter, at the fierce, beautiful intelligence in her eyes, and then he looked at Elara, his own eyes shining with a gratitude that no words could ever capture. Elara smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. The silence that had once screamed of neglect had finally been answered. It had been filled, not with noise or victory, but with the quiet, steady, and resilient language of love. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was a language they would all continue to learn, together, for the rest of their lives,